Hello, today I'm here to talk about my most disappointing reads of 2018. And I did specifically call this video my most disappointing reads because I don't want to call it worst books, because these aren't bad books, they're just books that didn't work for me and didn't live up to what I was expecting from them. So I'm going to jump right in with the Three Dark Crowns series by Kendall Blake. This series, I'll read you the synopsis actually. So it says, in every generation on the island of Fenburn, a set of triplets is born, 3 queens, all equal heirs to the crown, all possessed of a coveted magic. Mirabella, a fierce elemental, can spark hungry flames with a click of a finger. Catherine, a poisoner, is known to be resistant to the deadliest of snake bites. Arsinoe, a naturalist, is rumoured to have the ability to bloom the reddest of roses. But becoming the queen crowned is not just a matter of royal birth. These 3 sisters must fight to the death for the throne, and on the night they turn 16, the battle begins. Only one queen can inherit the crown. Whose side are you on? I've said it before on this channel, and I'll say it again. That synopsis sounds so brutal and so interesting, very reminiscent of the Hunger Games, which I loved, and I was so ready for it. But it's not. It's not what the synopsis says it is to me. This is a young adult series, and it's on the very young side of young adult, I'd say, and there's nothing wrong with that, but don't sell a book to me as being really brutal and intense and fight to the death if that's not what it's about. The pacing of this is really, really slow. And I mean, I don't want to say anything that's going to spoil it, but it's not the story that I thought I was going to be reading. And if I had known what I was going to be reading, I probably would have really enjoyed this one. But it's the story of 3 girls finding themselves and dealing with a situation that none of them wants to be in. And if that is what it had said on the back, then I'd have been there for that too. But I was disappointed by this one because it's not what I signed up for. And if somebody wants to write a version of this that is what it sounds like, then please do, because I am all for it. But I'm annoyed by synopses that just aren't actually reflective of what the book is going to be about. And that made it disappointing for me, and it really didn't need to be. So it's a real shame. So if you're going to read this series, go into it thinking of it as a story of 3 sisters who are put in an awful situation, and they have to come to terms with it and deal with it in their own very, very different ways. If you go into it like that, I think you'll enjoy it. The next book I'm going to talk about is Strange Practice by Vivian Shaw. This book follows a doctor named Greta Helsing, and she treats mythical creatures. Think vampires, think werewolves, ghouls, mummies, ghosts, etc. And when some monks start killing these mythical beings, Greta Helsing and her friends have to figure out what is going on and solve it before the humans find out. That premise is really, really interesting to me. I quite like things about doctors, but actually this book doesn't follow Greta Helsing quite as much as I anticipated, and it certainly doesn't follow her practice as a doctor, so don't go into it expecting that. I think that's what I was expecting. I was expecting more of that side of the story, and because I didn't get it, it was just a bit disappointing for me, because that's what I was kind of hoping for. Aside from that, it is a good book. It is interesting. It's a little bit strange, but I mean, you can tell that from the concept and the synopsis. It's a bit of a weird story. We have some nice characters in this. Greta Helsing is the protagonist in this book, but actually I didn't connect with her as much as some of the other characters, and I think if this book had been spun as from the perspective of some of the non-humans, then it perhaps would have been a bit better. But I think really the main reason this disappointed me is because I thought there was going to be more medical stuff in it, and there just didn't end up being. So it was a bit of a miss for me, unfortunately. But like I said, still a good book, just not for me. Next, I'm going to talk about a couple of books that I don't actually have here to show you because I read them as ebooks. And first up, we have The School for Good and Evil by Soman Chainani. Now, this is a middle grade series. I've only read book 1 and I probably won't be continuing on with the series. It follows 2 girls, Sophie and Agatha, who grew up in this village where once a year a child, it could be a boy or a girl, between the ages of 11 and 16, I think, is taken, and it's said that they are taken to the school for good and evil, and Agatha and Sophie are selected. Sophie has always wanted to go and Agatha just wants to save her best friend, but then when they get to the school for good and evil they end up in the wrong schools. Agatha is a different kind of girl. She doesn't care about her appearance and she is considered a little bit odd, and Sophie presumes that Agatha will end up in the school for evil, but she doesn't. Agatha ends up in the school for good, and Sophie, who enjoys her looks and wants to be a princess, ends up in the school for evil. And Agatha's whole thing is that she wants to get them home, and Sophie's whole thing is that she wants to get them into the right schools. And we follow their adventures dealing with that. And I liked the idea of this book, I liked the premise of it. I mean, it was very, very predictable, but then it's middle grade, so I kind of expect that with a book that's aimed at that age range. You don't want to make it too complicated because otherwise you're not going to keep those kinds of readers engaged with the story. I think the reason that this one was disappointing for me wasn't anything to do with the plot, it wasn't anything to do with the character development or the world, it was to do with the writing, which just didn't suit my reading tastes. I personally found some of the writing problematic. I felt like some of the grammar wasn't the way that I would write things, and I'm really pedantic when it comes to grammar. I'm a solicitor. It's just like I can't help but proofread a book virtually when I'm reading it, so some of those errors really annoyed me, and I think the reason I was disappointed in it is because I kind of expect a higher standard of writing for a middle grade book than even an adult book, because with a middle grade book, that age group is reading to improve their vocabulary and their written word skills as well as enjoy the story, and I just felt like it wasn't the best way to teach a young person to write, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend it for somebody within that age range, and for that reason it was just a bit disappointing for me. Nothing wrong with the story, as I say, it was predictable, but that's fair enough. So yeah, I just wasn't a fan of the writing style, unfortunately, and for that reason it was a disappointing read for me. The next book I'm going to talk about is Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman, which is potentially a little bit controversial, although admittedly not as controversial as the next series I'm going to talk about, because Neverwhere is a much loved book. This is a urban fantasy story set in a version of London where there is London above, normal London, and London below, which is a weird and wonderful world where things are just a little bit topsy-turvy and we've got strange beings and things are just a little bit different, and it's really difficult to describe how things are different, but just trust me, they're weird. And ordinarily I would like that sort of thing. Like, for example, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is weird, but I really like it. But I don't know, maybe Neverwhere was just a little bit too weird for me. I have a really hard time putting my finger on exactly what it is about this book that I didn't like or that disappointed me. I think part of it is that the protagonist, whose name I forget but I'll write it somewhere, I wasn't a huge fan of. I just felt like he was a little bit whiny and a little bit scared. And the funny thing is that if I was in his situation, I'd probably be a hell of a lot worse than he was. So his reaction to the situations he was put in was entirely reasonable and he came good in the end. But I don't know, he was a bit of a follow-along character. He kind of just went along with what everybody else wanted to do, and I tend to prefer slightly stronger-willed characters in my books, so that was a little bit disappointing. Also, I suppose I kind of struggled with this book to understand what the point of it was, other than just being weird. And that just might be me and me struggling to understand what it was that I was reading. I don't think that's a fault with the book. I think that's a fault with the reader, this guy. So, yeah, unfortunately, just a bit disappointing for me because I was expecting this really. I think what it was is that it was described to me as a whimsical story, and it's not whimsical, it's just a bit odd. And also, I suppose, it's set in London and I live in London, so I kind of was expecting to connect with it more than perhaps I did. I don't know, I have a complex relationship with this book, and I'm not ruling out revisiting it at some point because I think it's the kind of book that I do have the potential to like, but at the time that I read it, I just didn't enjoy it that much, and I really wanted to enjoy it more, and that's why it was disappointing to me. So that's my feelings for now about Neverwhere. The last and final series that I am going to talk about in this video is the controversial one, the Shades of Magic series by V.E. Schwab. I know, so many people absolutely love this series, and that's why it was disappointing. The hype really spoiled this one for me, unfortunately, I think. This series follows a man named Kel, who is an Antari, which is a blood magician who can travel between parallel worlds. In this particular series, we're talking about London. So we have 4 versions of London, 4 parallel universes. We have Black London, that has been consumed by magic, White London, which is being consumed by magic, Red London, which is flourishing with magic, and Grey London, who has lost their magic. And Kel has this habit of taking items between the various Londons, which is something that he's not supposed to do. And when he takes something that he really, really shouldn't have, things go horribly, horribly wrong. That premise sounds so interesting. Again, it's a London-based story and I'm all for it, but unfortunately, it was the pacing of this that really, really spoiled it for me. I kind of knew going into it that the pacing was going to be a problem, but I didn't realise the extent of the problem until I was in there. So this first book doesn't really get going until about 70% of the way through, and then it's way too fast after that. Oh no, this is A Gathering of Shadows, sorry, I thought I was holding up Dark Shade of Magic. Dark Shade of Magic is the first book, so about 70% of it is pretty slow, the last 30% way too fast. A Gathering of Shadows, in my opinion, is slow the whole way through, although I kind of preferred the basic plot line in this one. And then A Conjuring of Light is faster, and it's pretty steadily quick all the way through, but I don't think it was enough to recover from these 2 books. Unfortunately, I also read this one at a time in my life when things weren't going very well personally, so I couldn't really appreciate this one as much as I perhaps otherwise would have. But these 2, they don't have that excuse. I'd heard so many great things about this series, so many people on BookTube talking about how much they love them and how amazing they think they are. Unfortunately, that just made it a disappointing read for me because they just weren't all that they were cracked up to be. They're an interesting story, it's an interesting concept, but I didn't connect overly with the characters. The plot was interesting but not super gripping for me, and I think that Schwab could have done so much more with this world and this premise than she did, in my opinion. So for those reasons, it was a disappointing read for me, particularly because I really, really desperately wanted to love this series and I just didn't. And that's it. Sorry that this video was a bit of a downer, but the clue is in the title. If you loved any of these books, then please tell me why down below, and maybe when I reread them at some point in the future, if I do, then I'll have a different perspective to take into account when I'm doing so. But that's it for this one. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video and want to see more like this from me, then do think about hitting that subscribe button. I'd be so grateful. And I hope to see you here again soon. Thanks! Bye!